On this episode of the show, I have with me Aaron Painter. He is CEO at Nametag, and we're going to be talking about deepfakes in the workplace. And we're going to cover fake hiring, help desk attacks, and some of the onboarding issues that he's seeing out there on the market, some caused by AI. And we're going to be talking about the impact to employers and companies and some of the solutions he's seeing out there, some of the learnings, and some of the advice. Aaron, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Before we dive in, can you tell us what Nametag does?
Yes, we do identity verification in high assurance scenarios, like when you are onboarding a new user and making sure that maybe the employee you've hired is not a North Korean, or otherwise when someone might call the help desk and pretend to be an employee and claiming that they need privileged access or their MFA or credentials reset. We focus on these use cases that tend to really matter and kind of are on the periphery of typically your enterprise applications like a ServiceNow or a Workday, or moments when you're trying to get back in or get provisioned to something like an Okta or a Duo or an Entra. You're trying to get back in or get provisioned to something.
I'm sure the
like
audience knows what
Okta
deepfakes are, but I guess when we're talking about deepfakes in the workplace, I mean, how big of a problem is that? What's the magnitude? What's the scope of this issue?
Deepfakes are a really important concept. It's a term that's only been around since 2017, 2018. It was coined initially by a kind of a Reddit user talking about using celebrities and putting celebrity faces on revealing bodies in kind of adult content. And since then, the tools, as we all know, in the world of generative AI have made it such that it's become really easy to create synthetic content. And one of the ways that we most often see that synthetic content used is to impersonate someone else. And so you can now, with only a few seconds of someone's audio clip, like from this podcast or a social media post or otherwise, create a voice replica of that person. And certainly the same thing with photos or video feeds. So it means that a lot of the digital channels that we rely on to sort of trust what we see or hear are increasingly in question, because you don't necessarily know if someone is using, deepfake emulator technology to impersonate someone else and come across and look like or sound like that person you think you're speaking with.
When you look at, and I guess people have seen that across various channels, we've heard about it in the news at this point. When it comes to some of the areas we're going to be talking about fake hiring, help desk attacks, you mentioned that, some of the onboarding issues. Is that common for somebody to want to try to, a help desk attack, or somebody trying to pass off a fake ID through all the different, I guess, checks of the hiring process?
Sadly, it's become far too common. And it really started about 2.5 years ago with the MGM attack. And poor MGM, that they became the sort of poster child for this. But in that scenario, as strong as multi-factor authentication is, as strong as the security measures you might have in your enterprise environment are, it's sort of only as effective as the recovery mechanisms you have. And so what we saw in the MGM case was a bad actor calling the IT help desk, pretending to be an employee who was locked out of their MFA, and they needed those credentials reset. And it became sort of this fascinating case study of how does that happen? All these efforts we've made to make sure that the way that someone logs in, that they authenticate, that they are secure. But the weak link turned out to just call and pretend that you are that user and you're locked out of being able to use those methods. And so in MGM's case, 8 minutes into the call, using a variety of techniques, including deepfakes as part of that conversation, they were able to get their credentials reset. The bad actor then went in, deposited ransomware, took over the account, and took down the company for 2+ weeks. And that started an epidemic, frankly, across corporate America in particular, and we're seeing it now wildly in healthcare and in certain other industries, but where people are using this same attack vector of calling the help desk, pretending that you were the employee, and that you're not able to access your account. And that used to just be kind of being a con artist. It used to be sort of a smooth talker, kind of scamming your way in. It's just that we've now given these bad actors superpowers with Gen AI tools, so they can be even more convincing in their social engineering efforts at the help desk, or in those other modes where it's just too easy to claim that you are locked out. So it's been a wild epidemic, to your point on how often. And it seemed like things calmed down a little bit last year, although in the last couple of weeks even, we've just seen this extreme resurgence of similar bad actor groups going after the very same attack vector.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like you mentioned, deep fakes. Conrad is trying to, get by and get into a system like that or impersonate somebody is down to a particular skill level. With advanced tools that we're seeing out there, some of these, Gen AI tools, the ability to synthesize voice and the synthetic data. I guess when you're looking, and you mentioned the bad actors are gravitating towards using this for these purposes, how quickly are you seeing technology being developed to counter this? Because it seems like for every technology evolution or a moment in tech that we see, we always see there's a bad use case and obviously a generally good use case. What are you seeing in this case?
Yeah, there's a broader philosophical discussion that's actually very fun. There are great use cases for deepfakes. Pausing there for a moment.
Okay.
Reenacting historical events, bringing back loved ones, and being able to carry conversations with them. I mean, there are many wonderful use cases, but there are bad use cases as well, like we've talked about. And the challenge is the technology that has started to develop in this space has been a lot around what we call deepfake detection. And there are a handful of companies chasing this. And essentially the principle is use AI to detect AI. So, is my AI model better than the bad actors? And, can we detect that someone is using something synthetic? And it's a noble effort and an important one. Our principle on that, though, is that it's a bit of an arms race. There will always be someone who's slightly ahead and someone who's slightly behind. And increasingly, the bad actors have had a leg up in that there's just many of them and they're sharing their techniques. And there are just obvious vulnerabilities today in how a lot of this stuff works. And so they're taking advantage of it. The principle that kind of grounded us, though, also was, are there other technologies besides AI that we can use to prevent someone from using AI? And one of the biggest ones that became a breakthrough for us was cryptography. And cryptography, as we know, has been something that so much of our digital infrastructure is based on. And it turns out when you can combine cryptography with AI and even things like biometrics and put that sort of in combo, you have a much stronger arsenal to compete against a bad actor who might just be using AI and trying to use a deepfake. So that's sort of the technology side. And we can talk more about how that's used and deployed. But that's sort of been our big insight, is put more at the fight than simply an AI versus AI battle.
Interesting. I guess maybe just to take a step back from there, if you're an enterprise and maybe you're not aware that this is an issue, maybe you are, I don't know. Obviously, there's tons of security frameworks, security products, audits. Does this come up in any of those type activities? Are the companies detecting that they have this as some kind of weak point within their security framework, or are they just unaware until it's too late?
Yeah, today it's starting to get so mainstream that it's rare to meet a security professional in an enterprise who isn't thinking about or aware of this. Frankly, might have a board directive to go solve it. We see this mix of folks who have come to us often because they've had a breach, and it started typically at the help desk or around one of those recovery mechanisms, or they're just so aware of it because their friends have all gone through it and they're trying to be proactive and think through it. Unlike MFA, that was often, I might argue, was driven a lot by insurance industry and particularly cyber insurance as kind of a requirement. This hasn't quite reached that level yet, where insurers are not requiring that you evaluate your recovery mechanisms as much as you evaluate your MFA. And so we are seeing it, though, in multiple sort of suggested attack frameworks and CISA, FBI, Homeland Security, other guidance. Similarly, in the healthcare space, a kind of long list of government recommendations to look at it. And we're seeing it increasingly from penetration testing firms. So the folks that are doing either security training and awareness or those that conduct penetration tests for enterprises are almost always now including this in their sort of standard arsenal. For example, let me try and, quote, penetrate your help desk, right? Let me call and pretend to be a user who is unable to access things and see what your processes are and see how your help desk reps handle that, and if they're able to kind of get through on that attack vector. And so for the firms that are being proactive or thoughtful in those regular processes, that's starting to be where they catch it. But your question is a very good one, and kind of who's pushing this beyond just the market awareness of professionals that are talking about it so actively.
Absolutely. I guess when you're looking at this from the perspective of, you mentioned, where this started, when this started, a lot of people have been, obviously through the pandemic, people were remote. It's a whole different discussion, a whole different episode of where that's going. But if we would see the extension of more remote or global teams or distributed teams, as a lot of tech companies have traditionally had, and you're looking to hire locally, does a solution that prevents this, is it something that actually crosses those global boundaries? Is are there different requirements per country? Is this something that if you have a solution and you are hiring global, you need to be aware of different factors?
Yeah, 100%. In fact, most of what we find are, we primarily focus with US based enterprises, but they all have enormous global footprints. And so you have to be as good at this anywhere in the world almost as you would be otherwise if the employee was based in the US. And remember, it's employees, but it's often also contractors and outsourced employees. And so, even the firm that said, well, we moved to all in person again, amazing. They have enormous contingent typically of outsourced or contract workers or folks that are in other offices or remote offices. When I started at Microsoft, I was there for 14 years. And, in the early days, I actually had to go to the security office to get my smart card badge and to configure what was my MFA at that time in order to be able to access the network. And if I somehow lost access, I had to go back in person to a physical office and solve that. And that's just not the norm today for the standard enterprise out there, that they would require users to do that. But yet they still need that same level of security assurance that they might have had at that point in time.
Absolutely.
And that's just not the norm
kind of
today
looking
for
at
the standard enterprise out there, that they would require users to do that. Right? So but yet they still need that same level of security assurance that they might have had at that point in time.
Combating, as you described, you don't want to make it an AI on AI. You want to focus on solving the real problem. A solution like this, where are we on just the maturity spectrum? Are we early because the problem's early? Is the components of the technology mature and it's just a different use case? Where do we sit within the maturity of this?
Yeah, I think given our experience in working with very large enterprises, I would say that it's really been some of the biggest brands out there, and frankly, some of the most security forward teams that were early in kind of spotting this, and then frankly, battle testing it. And in our case, as a company, putting us through the works of giving us feedback and challenging us, and penetration testing us before they bought and regularly, and it's allowed us at least to develop a very enterprise grade solution. That, by the way, continues to get better and more feature rich based on the feedback we get from our customers. But it's something that is very much in production today at some of the largest companies in the country.
Absolutely. Are you, as we see AI and we see foundational models evolving quickly, things are rapidly changing, how does that impact things? Because obviously pre-AI, there's a whole other set of problems. Now with AI, as you mentioned, everyone has access to the tool, but it's developing at a rapid pace. How does that factor into this?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in this category now of people talk about non-human identities, and is it a bot? Is it an IoT device? Like what is this other element that's out there doing things? And how do you help them authenticate? How can an AI agent log in as you, maybe to do some research or other things? And a lot of the discussion in this space has been, in our identity world in particular, has been thinking about identity of non-humans or these agents. But equally, there's this interest around security and how are you going to protect access to certain elements of data or certain actions, or really even attest back to some sort of human ownership. How do you bring a human in the loop into AI-based behavior? And that's a really fascinating topic that we're spending a lot of time on now with some of our customers, because human identities weren't really solved prior to the rise of AI and AI agents. This concept of, if you go, you're a new employee, let's say, and you're hired and you're enrolled into your, Active Directory or your Okta instance. Again, until just a couple of years ago, there wasn't even a way to try and verify someone remotely to know who you were enrolling in the environment. So solving human identities, is the person human, let alone which human, wasn't really solved prior to this world of agentic AI. And now you've got a compounding problem where AI agents are out acting on behalf of humans, but you don't necessarily know which human, let alone is there a human behind them to begin with. And so the need that we're trying to solve this in really the traditional world of enterprise authentication and login and everything else is just compounding as we think about it in this world of AI agents doing the same. And is there a human behind them to
Absolutely.
begin with?
And I guess as
And so
you're,
the need that we're
if
trying
you
to
have
solve
advice
this
for
in really the
companies
traditional world of
that
enterprise
are
authentication and
dealing with
login
this
and
as a
everything
problem, I
else
mean, are
is
there
just
things that, are there
compounding
learnings
as we
that
think
you've
about it in
seen
this world
across
of
I
AI
know you
agents
guys
doing
have,
the same.
plenty of customers leveraging the product. Love to hear some of the learnings, some of the experiences of maybe advice you have for companies out there dealing with this.
Yeah, I think one of our biggest learnings recently has been this interest in what we call re-verification. And so this concept that identity verification is not intended to be a moment in time action. The closest analogy I think of often is like credit cards. Like let's say a bank issues you a credit card and you have that physical card. It doesn't alone allow you to go charge on it, right? When you want to go buy something, you swipe that card and you're able to check through the merchant network. Is there available credit? Is this account open? Is it in good standing? And those sort of, that's credit at the moment or credit worthiness at the moment. Identity is a real time question. And it's often something that we need to be able to re-ask at various moments. And so for us, what started a couple of years ago we built this really unique way of doing identity verification that was built for security. And the big insight was take what had always been in a web browser, desktop or mobile, for sort of compliance settings of, have someone scan your ID and take a selfie, let's say when you're opening a new bank account. Our big insight was, let's just move that to mobile. If we do that same experience in a mobile device, it allows us all these security features of the cryptography on the device to know that the evidence that's being collected is from a secured channel, meaning someone isn't injecting a deepfake into that flow. And lets us use all the advanced cameras and sensors and telemetry from a mobile phone. And so suddenly you could do this much richer form of identity verification, and you could open up all these security use cases. So we started then, we thought, all right, well, this is happening at the help desk, right? A la MGM. When you call that help desk, those reps don't necessarily have good tools beyond security questions or maybe now a video call, which has this other risks of deepfakes associated with it. They don't really have good tools. And so we solved that first. And then we started learning very quickly from companies. They said, half of my help desk calls are people locked out of MFA. And so we really doubled down on integrating with the likes of the Okta and the Duo and the Entra and created a self-service mechanism for employees to be able to not have to call the help desk. Suddenly they could verify their identity and then instantly reach into Okta, Duo, and Entra. And for us as a company, that became kind of our breakaway product because it's just a gap in most of those providers today. But then about 6 months ago, it started around hiring. And that's where we started learning a lot of people saying, hey, I might have actually hired someone I didn't intend to. Yes, they might have been actually a North Korean like that. It sounded almost silly. And was it a North Korean? It turns out the North Koreans have gotten very good at this. Now, sometimes it's people, accessing in other countries. It's people working with agents in other countries and an intricate network. But there's an increasing number of North Koreans for sure. And they're getting hired. And so then you start to think, well, is this an HR problem? And that's when everyone gets a little bit confused. And do we bring in our HR teams? And HR says, well, look, we do background checks often of our employees in certain industries. Or we do an I-9 verification, let's say if they're in the US and they're verified to work. But it turns out background checks, 95% of them today are social security number based in the US, for example. And so if you're a bad actor, you just have someone's social security number and that social security number could pass a background check, but you don't actually know that's the candidate or the person that you're hiring. And so the challenge then shifted over to IT because in today's standard onboarding workflow, IT gets this work order from HR. We've just hired someone, go create an account for them and then email their personal email address or give to someone else their temporary username and password and an invitation to set up an account in our enterprise. And it turns out that is a really risky moment because if you don't know who you're hiring and then you're suddenly inviting that person into your environment, that moment of IT doing the initial credential provisioning has become sort of a low-hanging fruit for bad actors and also, frankly, a really easy one to be able to go secure and protect. So then once you start doing these things, if you're verifying the person when you're issuing credentials, you're verifying when they call the help desk, you're verifying when they might be locked out, well, can't you re-verify at other moments too? What if, let's say you see suspicious behavior and your SOC wants to, send out an alert or someone's asking to, access confidential data or, a company pitched us the other day, said, well, we lock the USB ports. Maybe we could unlock the USB ports for 10 minutes with the selfie re-verification. And so you start to find our biggest learning has been throw up that defensive wall at various moments in your enterprise when you see the need for some sort of privileged access or step up use case. And if you're doing it on mobile, one of our big insights was we actually don't need them to scan the ID each time. We can scan a government ID the first time, and then on future times use a cryptographically assured sort of three-dimensional selfie, not your standard web browser selfie, but recompare that selfie back to the earlier selfies, back to the government ID. And so it opens up these new use cases that previously weren't possible. And that's what a lot of people are really teaching us and finding creative ways to use today. Not your standard web browser selfie,
maybe more
but recompare that selfie back to the earlier selfies, back to the
I've been
government ID.
thinking about
And so it opens up these
the
new
attack
use
surface
cases
area
that previously weren't possible.
It keeps seemingly
And that's
expanding.
what a lot of people are really teaching
in
us
talking
and
to you,
finding creative ways
if
to
the
use
audience
today.
was an educator or was not aware of this, now we learned of a new facet of where you have to secure different assets and where AI is potentially accelerating other issues as this attack surface area is expanding. And obviously, as you mentioned, bad actors are using AI for their purposes, and AI has its advantages in trying to defend that. As a CISO out there, how complicated, I mean, it's probably a ridiculous question, it's probably obvious, but the complexity and the responsibility of trying to manage this ever-expanding attack surface. And I talked to somebody a couple of weeks ago that said they're worried about log injections, like down into the log level, and AI going in there and generating erroneous logs. Give me your thoughts on that. And again, I don't think this is going to be, I'm not going to hold you to it, or I think I know where you're going to go, but I just think it's a fascinating subject of how this attack surface area is just constantly expanding and accelerating in expansion.
There's no doubt. All right, as technology has advanced, its security has become so fundamental, and the role of the CISO has become more important, certainly harder and more complex. And I think that's also been one of the really interesting things in the last few years. We've been in this space 5 years, has been the role that identity is being seen and is playing in the world of security. And that's still an evolution. Amazing companies like Okta were created to do authentication. And only in recent years have they started to think of themselves as a security control and as a security company. I was at the RSA conference last week, and this topic was huge, exactly the question you're asking. But also it is really interesting if I go to a security conference like RSA and I see how few providers are even talking about identity. And then you go to a quote identity conference and there are very few people talking about security, and it's almost none of the same players that overlap. And so I think more and more people are starting to realize this intersection between identity and security. And not to say all by any means, but companies like Okta cite 80+% of cyber breaches today are identity related. And so more and more the concept of not protecting the perimeter with identity and identity done in a secure way, knowing who's human, knowing which human, it's created a lot of downstream problems. And so I think conversely, kind of getting that right and getting your identity infrastructure sound can at least reduce some of the attack surface, or maybe a decent amount of it, that you're seeing in this world of growing cyber threats.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing, Aaron. I think this is obviously a great topic, and obviously if people weren't aware, they are aware now. Hopefully they understand the topic better. If somebody does have questions, I know we didn't exhaust the technical side of this at all, but if somebody does have questions, what's a good way of learning more?
LinkedIn's really the place. For me and our company, we try and post a lot and publish content. I think what we've learned is that this stuff is changing so quickly, and bad actors are getting so sophisticated, and their knowledge sharing is often better than us on the good people side. And so trying to share what we're learning, talking about techniques, that's why I love coming on shows like yours and talking about this stuff. I think the more that we as a community know and can share what's working and what's not and what we're learning, just the better chances we have at keeping our digital lives and our digital infrastructure sound. So I appreciate you having me on today.
No, absolutely. Thank you for your time.
Talking about techniques. That's
It.
why I love coming on shows like yours
we'll
and talking about this stuff. I think the more that we as a community know and can share what's working and what's not and what we're learning, just the better chances we have at keeping our digital lives and our
in the workplace. I obviously talked about the fake hiring, onboarding issues, the help desk attacks, and Aaron walked us through some of the solutions, where bad actors are gaining some advantages and where technology is trying to counteract them. And share this episode with somebody else. I think it's important to kind of keep talking about some of these security issues. Can't really stress how important these are. And also subscribe, comment, let me know how the show is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.